The village of Oakhaven nestled deep within a valley, a place where the wind carried whispers of forgotten times and the rustling leaves seemed to murmur ancient secrets. Generations had lived and died within its embrace, their final resting place a sprawling, untended burial ground on the outskirts. Locals spoke in hushed tones of the old cemetery, claiming it held not just the bones of their ancestors, but also a silent guardian, a spirit tethered to the land and fiercely protective of its slumbering inhabitants. Tales were told around crackling fires of those who had dared to disturb the peace, their lives met with swift and inexplicable misfortune. Yet, as is often the case, desperation could deafen ears to even the most chilling warnings. Ken, a farmer whose land had yielded little more than dust for seasons, watched his family's meager savings dwindle with a gnawing anxiety. His younger brother, Tan, a man with a sharp mind and an even sharper ambition, couldn't bear to witness their slow decline. Unlike Ken, Tan held little truck with the village superstitions, dismissing them as old wives' tales meant to scare children. He saw only opportunity in the whispered rumors of treasures buried alongside Oakhaven's long-gone residents, relics, perhaps even gold, interred with those of higher standing. Tan had begun one evening, his voice low and conspiratorial as they sat by the flickering lamplight. "We can't continue like this. Another failed harvest, and we'll lose everything." Ken, his face etched with worry, had sighed. "But Tan, the stories. Baho himself warned us against going near the old grounds. He said the earth there remembers, and it doesn't take kindly to those who would defile it." Tan had scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "Baho is old and his mind wanders with the wind. Legends are just that, legends. While we sit here fearing shadows, others with more courage might be out there seizing what could save us." His eyes gleamed with a feverish intensity, a stark contrast to Ken's hesitant apprehension. The allure of a quick fortune, enough to pull their family from the brink, had taken root in Tan's mind, growing stronger with each passing day of hardship. Baho, the village elder, a man whose weathered face held the wisdom of countless seasons, had indeed cautioned against disturbing the ancient graves. His eyes, though clouded with age, held a piercing knowing when he spoke of the cemetery. "The spirits there are not at rest," he'd rasped, his voice like dry leaves skittering across the ground. "They sleep, yes, but they are not gone. Greed is a poison that blinds men to the truths that lie beneath the soil. Disturb the slumbering, and you invite a darkness you cannot comprehend." His words, spoken with the weight of experience and tradition, had sent a shiver down Ken's spine, yet Tan had remained unmoved, his skepticism a shield against the village's ingrained beliefs. In the days leading up to their ill-conceived plan, Oakhaven seemed to hold its breath. An unnatural stillness settled over the valley. The usually vibrant birdsong grew sparse, replaced by an unsettling silence. The wind, which usually carried the scent of pine and damp earth, now felt heavy, almost suffocating. Ken couldn't shake a growing sense of dread. He'd noticed a hawk circling the graveyard for hours, its sharp cries echoing through the quiet air, a sight no one in the village could recall ever witnessing before. Then there was the dream, a vivid, terrifying vision of skeletal hands reaching from the earth, their bony fingers grasping for him. He'd woken in a cold sweat, the image seared into his mind. He'd tried to share his unease with Tan, but his brother had simply brushed it off as the product of an overactive imagination fueled by fear. Despite Ken's mounting apprehension and the unsettling atmosphere that blanketed the village, Tan's relentless insistence and the gnawing desperation of their situation eventually wore him down. Under the cloak of a moonless night, the two brothers set out towards the old burial grounds, their tools, shovels and sacks, heavy in their hands. The air hung thick and still, the silence broken only by the soft crunch of their footsteps on the overgrown path. As they reached the cemetery gates, a rusted wrought iron arch that seemed to groan under the weight of years, a sudden gust of wind swept through the grounds, carrying with it a chilling whisper that sounded like a collective sigh of the long departed. Even Tan paused, a flicker of unease crossing his usually resolute face. But the lure of the potential reward was too strong to resist. They pushed open the creaking gates and stepped into the realm of the sleeping, their transgression about to awaken something ancient and unforgiving. As the shadows deepened around them, clinging to the weathered tombstones like shrouds, Ken and Tan began their grim task, the weight of their actions settling upon them like the heavy silence of the graveyard. The first shovelful of earth felt cold and damp, releasing a musty odor that spoke of decay and the long passage of time. It was a scent that would soon cling to them, a mark of their trespass against the silent city of the dead. their transgression about to awaken something ancient and unforgiving. The first shovelful of earth felt cold and damp, releasing a musty odor that spoke of decay and the long passage of time. It was a scent that would soon cling to them, a mark of their trespass against the silent city of the dead. The work was arduous, the soil compacted by years of undisturbed rest, interwoven with stubborn roots that snagged their tools. Ken's muscles burned with each scoop, his breath coming in ragged gasps, the silence amplifying the sound of his labored breathing. Beside him, Ton worked with a feverish intensity, his movements driven by the image of the gold he hoped to unearth, his face slick with sweat under the oppressive stillness of the night. Yet, even Ton's initial enthusiasm began to wane as the silence of the graveyard pressed in on them, broken only by the scraping of their shovels against stone or root and the occasional rustle of unseen creatures in the undergrowth, each sound seeming to carry an ominous weight. As they dug deeper into the first grave, a sense of profound unease settled over Ken, tightening like a knot in his stomach. It wasn't just the inherent wrongness of what they were doing, the violation of a final resting place, but a feeling that they were being watched, scrutinized by unseen eyes that held the wisdom and sorrow of centuries. He kept glancing around, half expecting to see something move among the shadows that danced between the tombstones, a flicker of movement, a shape that didn't belong, but there was only the stillness of the tombstones, their weathered inscriptions barely visible in the dim starlight filtering through the canopy of ancient trees, each name a silent testament to a life now past, a life they were so carelessly disturbing. A sudden chill permeated the air, raising goosebumps on his arms despite the exertion, a cold that seemed to rise from the very earth they were disturbing. He looked at Ton, whose brow was furrowed in concentration, his jaw tight as he focused on the task at hand, seemingly oblivious to the shift in the atmosphere, lost in his avaricious pursuit. "Did you feel that?" Ken whispered, his voice barely audible, a hushed plea in the oppressive silence. Ton grunted, pushing his shovel deeper into the earth, the sound grating in the stillness. "Feel what? My back aching?" "Yes." "Now be quiet, we're almost there." His impatience was growing, fueled by the physical strain and the nagging unease that he tried to ignore. They continued to dig, the silence punctuated by the thud of their tools against something solid, a dull, resonant sound that made Ken's heart leap with a fresh wave of apprehension. Ken's heart pounded with a mixture of fear and anticipation, a frantic drumbeat against the silence. It was a wooden coffin, its aged planks softened by time and the damp earth, the wood groaning softly as their shovels scraped against it. With trembling hands, they pried open the lid, the rusted hinges protesting with a screech that seemed to tear through the quiet, revealing the skeletal remains of a woman, her bones draped in the remnants of what might have once been fine burial clothes, now faded and tattered like ghostly shrouds. And there, nestled beside her withered hand, were several intricately crafted gold bracelets, their metal still gleaming faintly in the darkness, catching the meager starlight like captured moonlight. A gasp escaped Ton's lips, a sound of greedy wonder. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the cool metal, a tangible link to the wealth he had only imagined. "We did it," he breathed, his voice filled with a triumphant awe that momentarily overshadowed the somber reality of their surroundings, a selfish victory in a place of eternal rest. Ken felt a surge of relief, a momentary lifting of the crushing weight of their desperation, quickly followed by a wave of guilt, a sharp pang of remorse for their sacrilege. The gold was beautiful, undeniably valuable, promising an escape from their hardship, but it had come at a cost, the violation of a sacred resting place, a debt they didn't know how they would repay. As they carefully collected the bracelets and placed them in their sack, the clinking of gold against fabric a jarring sound in the stillness, a low moan seemed to drift through the graveyard, carried on a sudden, inexplicable breeze that rustled the leaves overhead, a mournful sigh that seemed to emanate from the very earth. Ken froze, his eyes wide with terror, his blood running cold despite the exertion. "Did you hear that?" he stammered, clutching Ton's arm, his grip tight with fear. Ton, his face pale despite his earlier bravado, his eyes darting nervously around the fog-shrouded tombstones, nodded slowly. I think so." He tried to appear nonchalant, shrugging it off as the wind playing tricks, but Ken could see the fear lurking in the depths of his eyes, a reflection of his own growing dread. They worked quickly then, their movements jerky and uncoordinated, driven by a newfound urgency to finish and leave this place before whatever had moaned returned. They moved to another grave, its marker a moss-covered stone barely legible, and then another, each yielding a small bounty of gold, necklaces, rings, and coins, each piece feeling cold and heavy in their hands, imbued with a sense of wrongness. With each discovery, their initial excitement waned, the thrill of the find replaced by a growing sense of dread and the chilling feeling that they were pushing their luck too far, that they were drawing the attention of something they couldn't comprehend. As they were about to leave, their sacks heavy with their stolen treasure, the weight of their sin pressing down on them, a series of unsettling events began to unfold, as if the guardian of the graveyard had finally stirred. A thick fog, seemingly materializing from nowhere, not drifting in but rising from the very ground, rolled through the graveyard, obscuring the tombstones and twisting familiar shapes into grotesque figures that seemed to watch them from the swirling mist. Strange sounds echoed through the fog, faint whispers that seemed to call their names, a sibilant murmur just at the edge of hearing, the soft shuffling of unseen feet on the fallen leaves, and a high-pitched whine that seemed to vibrate in their very bones, sending shivers down their spines and raising the hairs on the back of their necks. Paranoia began to take root in their minds, a poisonous mind twisting around their thoughts. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, a lurking presence waiting to pounce. Every rustle of leaves sounded like an approaching presence, the stealthy footsteps of something not of this world. They argued in hushed tones, their voices tight with fear, each accusing the other of making noises, of imagining things, their nerves frayed and their senses heightened to an unbearable degree. The camaraderie that had brought them here, the bond of brotherhood forged in shared hardship, dissolved into a tense mistrust, each suspecting the other was hearing or seeing things they weren't admitting, the stolen gold now a silent wedge between them, a symbol of their fractured unity. Back in the village, Mrs. Lon, a woman respected for her gentle nature and unwavering loyalty, felt a growing unease, a prickling sensation that something was terribly wrong. One of the graves the brothers had disturbed belonged to her dearest friend, Ilara, a woman whose kindness had touched many lives in Oakhaven and whose memory Mrs. Lon cherished. Mrs. Lon visited Ilara's resting place every week, a quiet ritual of remembrance, tending to the wildflowers she planted there, their vibrant colors a small testament to Ilara's spirit. This morning, she found the earth freshly turned, the delicate blooms uprooted and scattered as if by a violent hand. A cold dread washed over her, a premonition of something wicked. It was not just the disturbed earth, the physical evidence of desecration, but a palpable sense of sorrow and anger that seemed to emanate from the ground, a silent scream of violated peace. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that someone had violated the sanctity of Ilara's final sleep, and a deep, protective fury began to simmer within her. Her grief turned to suspicion, her gentle heart hardening with a resolve to uncover who had committed this sacrilege and to ensure they faced the consequences of their actions. The first of the brothers to be truly afflicted was Tan. That night, after they had hidden the gold beneath the loose floorboards of their hut, the weight of their secret a tangible presence in the small space, and tried to appear as if nothing had changed, forcing strained smiles for their worried family, he was plagued by vivid, terrifying nightmares that felt more real than the waking world. He tossed and turned in his sleep, his body writhing as if in the grip of an unseen force, muttering incoherently, his face contorted in fear, his brow slick with a cold sweat. He dreamed of skeletal figures rising from the earth, their eyes burning with cold fury like embers in the darkness, their bony fingers reaching for him, their touch like the icy grip of death itself. He woke in a cold sweat, gasping for breath, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs, the lingering terror of the dream clinging to him like a shroud, suffocating him with its icy grip. He tried to dismiss it as just a bad dream, the product of their stressful night and too much cheap ale, but the sheer intensity and realism of the vision, the feeling that he had truly been in that terrifying place, shook him more than he cared to admit, leaving him with a gnawing unease that shadowed his waking hours. Kien, though he hadn't experienced nightmares as vivid as Tan's, was haunted by a persistent feeling of guilt and dread that clung to him like a second skin. Every creak of the floorboards in their small hut sounded like approaching footsteps, every shadow in the corner of his eye seemed to writhe with unseen movement, sending a jolt of fear through him that made his heart pound against his ribs. He found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, a nervous tick that his wife might noticed with growing concern, convinced that they were being watched, that they would somehow be made to pay for their crime, not just in this life but perhaps in the next. The weight of the stolen gold, hidden beneath the loose floorboards where they hoped no one would find it, felt heavier each day, not in its physical mass, but in the burden it placed on his conscience, a silent accusation that followed him everywhere. He saw the worry etched on Mai's face, the subtle shift in the villagers' demeanor, a coolness in their greetings, a sense of something being amiss that permeated their once peaceful community, a shadow falling over their lives that had not been there before. He longed to confess, to unburden himself to Father Tien, perhaps, and seek some form of absolution, but the fear of the consequences, both earthly, the shame, the ostracization, maybe even imprisonment, and perhaps otherworldly, the wrath of the disturbed spirits, held him captive in his silence, a prisoner of his own guilt. He would often stare into the flickering lamplight, seeing not the gentle glow but the dancing shadows that seemed to mimic the skeletal hands from his troubled sleep. The simple act of eating became a chore, the food tasting like dust in his mouth, and the laughter of children playing outside their huts sounded to him like mocking echoes. As the days passed, the psychological impact of their actions began to manifest in other, more disturbing ways. Tom became withdrawn and irritable, his earlier bravado, the confident swagger of a man who believed he had outsmarted fate, replaced by a jumpiness and a quick temper that flared at the slightest provocation. He would snap at Kian for the smallest thing, a misplaced tool, a question asked at the wrong time, his nerves seemingly constantly on edge, stretched taut like a bowstring ready to snap. He started drinking heavily, seeking solace in the numbing embrace of cheap rice wine, hoping to drown out the persistent whispers in his mind and the terrifying images that haunted his sleep, but it only seemed to exacerbate his paranoia, making him see threats in every shadow, and fuel his nightmares, which grew increasingly vivid and violent. He would wake up screaming in the dead of night, his body drenched in sweat, convinced that the cold, bony fingers were reaching for him, his cries disturbing the already tense atmosphere of their small hut. Ken, on the other hand, became increasingly withdrawn and quiet, the guilt eating away at him from the inside like a relentless parasite. He lost his appetite, the simple meals might prepared tasting like ash in his mouth, his sleep became fitful, punctuated by jolts of terror that left him trembling in the darkness, and a persistent shadow of fear clung to him, a constant reminder of their transgression. They had sought to alleviate their earthly troubles with stolen riches, believing that gold could solve any problem, but in doing so, they had invited a far more profound and terrifying torment into their lives, a torment that whispered from the earth itself, promising a price far greater than they could ever have imagined, a debt that no amount of gold could ever repay. The stolen gold, meant to be their salvation, was rapidly becoming the instrument of their damnation, a cursed treasure that was poisoning their lives from the inside out, turning brother against brother and casting a pall over their entire existence. The first true haunting struck Old Man, the most superstitious of their small group, a man whose face was a roadmap of wrinkles etched by years of believing in the old ways. He had boasted the loudest about their cleverness, how they had outsmarted the dead, their silent slumberers now their unwitting benefactors. One evening, as he sat alone in his dilapidated hut, the floorboards creaking under his weight, counting his share of the gold by the dim light of an oil lamp, its flame casting long, dancing shadows on the mud walls, the flame suddenly flickered and died, plunging him into absolute darkness, a darkness that felt heavy and suffocating. A cold, clammy hand, its touch like the skin of a corpse, brushed against his cheek, and a voice, thin and reedy like the wind whistling through broken reeds or the dry rustle of autumn leaves, whispered his name, a chilling sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. He screamed, a raw, primal sound of pure terror that tore through the night's stillness, and fumbled for his tinderbox, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, but his hands were shaking so violently he couldn't strike a spark, the flint and steel slipping uselessly through his trembling fingers. When the lamp finally sputtered back to life, casting a weak, flickering glow, the hut was empty, the shadows retreating into the corners, but the terror in Mana's eyes was unmistakable, a wide-eyed, vacant stare that spoke of an encounter with something beyond mortal comprehension. He never spoke of what happened, clamping his mouth shut as if afraid the very air would carry his fear, but he became a gaunt, trembling shadow of his former self, his skin ashen, his eyes wide with a perpetual fear that never left them. He refused to leave his hut after dark, barricading the door and windows as if trying to keep out not just earthly intruders but something far more sinister. Then it was Ben, a younger man whose youthful bravado had led him to join their grave-robbing scheme more out of a sense of reckless adventure and the allure of easy money than true desperation. He had scoffed at Mana's fear, calling him a foolish old man whose mind had been addled by too many ghost stories. One night, as he walked home from the village tavern, his steps unsteady from too much rice wine and his laughter still echoing in the night air, a figure emerged from the dense fog that often clung to the fields after dark, a swirling white mist that seemed to swallow sound and distort shapes. It was tall and gaunt, its form indistinct in the fog, its face obscured by shadow, but its eyes glowed with an unnatural, malevolent light, two piercing points of cold fire that seemed to bore into his very soul. Ben tried to run, his drunken swagger vanishing in a wave of pure terror, but his legs felt heavy as lead, as if rooted to the spot, and the figure glided towards him with an unnatural speed, its silent approach, the lack of any footfalls or rustling of clothes, more terrifying than any scream. He collapsed in terror, his body hitting the damp earth with a thud, and when he finally dared to look up through his tear-filled eyes, the figure was gone, vanished as silently as it had appeared, leaving only the lingering chill in the air and the frantic pounding of his heart, a terror that sobered him instantly and completely. Ben never went to the tavern again, locking himself in his small hut and refusing to speak to anyone, his youthful exuberance extinguished by a single, terrifying encounter. The hauntings grew bolder, more direct, as if the spirit was growing impatient with their fear in silence. One morning, Ken awoke before dawn, the first rays of light just beginning to paint the sky with hues of gray and pale pink, to find strange symbols etched into the dirt outside his door. They were intricate and unsettling, lines and curves that seemed to writhe like disturbed worms, symbols he didn't recognize but which filled him with a primal unease, a sense of ancient malevolence directed specifically at him. He quickly brushed them away, his heart pounding with a fresh wave of fear, desperate that Mai wouldn't see them and become even more worried. Tan found his share of the gold, the heavy coins and bracelets they had so greedily stolen, scattered across the dirt floor of his hut, covered in a strange, black dust that smelled of decay and the grave, a sickening odor that clung to the air and made him gag. The whispers followed them even in broad daylight, no longer confined to the shadows of night, faint and indistinct, just at the edge of hearing, but always present, a constant, insidious reminder of their crime, a spectral murmur that eroded their sanity. As fear gripped the small group of robbers, their ill-gotten gains turning to ashes in their mouths, they began to turn on each other, the bonds of their shared crime dissolving under the weight of their terror. Accusations flew freely, sharp and bitter, each suspecting the others of somehow bringing this curse upon them, their paranoia twisting their perceptions. Man, in his terrified delirium, his eyes darting wildly, accused Tan of having angered the spirits with his skepticism, his disbelief acting as a beacon for their wrath. Tan, in turn, his face pale and drawn, accused Man of being too weak, his fear somehow attracting the malevolent presence, his terror a contagious disease that was now infecting them all. Qian tried to mediate, his voice weak and pleading, but the growing paranoia was a powerful force, driving them apart, shattering any semblance of unity. They met in secret, their hushed arguments held in the shadows of abandoned barns or deep within the whispering bamboo groves, their voices tight with fear and recrimination, the stolen gold now a source of terror rather than salvation, a cursed hoard that was tearing them apart. News of the strange occurrences, the whispers of hauntings and unexplained illnesses that seemed to plague the men who had suddenly met their sudden, unexplained wealth, began to spread through Oak Haven. Whispers of hauntings and unexplained illnesses reached the ears of Father Tien, the village priest, a kind and learned man whose gentle eyes had witnessed countless joys and sorrows within the community over his many years of service. He listened to the frightened villagers, his brow furrowed with concern, his hand resting reassuringly on their trembling shoulders. He had heard the old legends of the burial ground since he was a child, tales passed down through generations like precious heirlooms, and he knew that the desecration of such a place holding the memories and spirits of their ancestors, could have unforeseen and terrible consequences, stirring forces best left undisturbed. He began his own quiet investigation, a solitary figure visiting the disturbed graves under the pale light of dawn, observing the strange atmosphere that now clung to the cemetery like a shroud, the unnatural stillness broken only by sudden gusts of cold wind that seemed to whisper through the ancient stones. He spoke with Baho, the village elder, his voice raspy with age and wisdom, who confirmed the ancient warnings, his eyes holding a deep sadness, and spoke of a specific spirit, tied to the land by a tragic event in the village's distant past, a tale of betrayal and heartbreak, a spirit whose wrath, once awakened, was not to be taken lightly. Baho spoke of Alara, the young woman whose grave had been so carelessly violated, and revealed a hidden history, a story of lost love and stolen inheritance, hinting that the gold the brothers had unearthed might be more than just grave goods. Mrs. Lon, meanwhile, continued her own search for the perpetrators of the grave robbery, her quiet grief for Ilara hardening into a steely resolve. Her grief for Ilara, a woman whose laughter still echoed in her memory, fueled her determination to see justice served for this desecration. She spoke with other villagers, her voice low but firm, who had noticed the brothers' sudden acquisition of wealth, the heavy gold jewelry Mai now wore with a nervous pride, their increasingly nervous demeanor, the way they flinched at sudden sounds, and their increasingly erratic behavior, their once friendly greetings now curt and avoided. Piecing together the fragments of information, the hushed whispers and worried glances, a grim suspicion began to form in her mind, a cold certainty that pointed towards Qian and Tan. She watched them, her eyes filled with a sorrowful accusation, noticing their haunted expressions, the dark circles under their eyes, and the way they avoided the gaze of others, their guilt a palpable presence that hung around them like the stench of the disturbed earth. The twist in the spirit's motive, the deeper tragedy that lay beneath the surface of simple vengeance, began to reveal itself in the dreams that now plagued Qian as well, twisting his sleep into a nightly torment. They were not just terrifying visions of skeletal figures rising from the earth, their empty eye sockets burning with spectral fire, but fragmented glimpses of a tragedy from the past, a recurring scene that felt both alien and intimately familiar, a young woman, her face filled with a sorrow that mirrored his own guilt, being betrayed by a man whose features remained frustratingly indistinct, left to die near the very burial grounds they had defiled, clutching a small pouch that seemed to gleam with a soft, inner light, a light that Qian somehow knew was the same gold they had stolen. The dreams were disjointed and confusing, fleeting images and whispered words that dissolved upon waking, but Ken felt a growing, sickening sense that the spirit's vengeance was not just about the disturbed graves, a general wrath against those who disrespected the dead, but about something more personal, a specific wrong that needed to be righted, something connected to the gold itself and perhaps to the long-buried history of Oakhaven. Was the spirit simply lashing out at those who disturbed its rest, a primal scream of outrage from beyond the grave, or was it seeking something specific, something that had been stolen long ago, a treasure of both material and sentimental value? The answer, Ken feared, would be revealed in the escalating terror that was gripping their small village, a terror that had been unleashed by their greed and was now reaching out to claim them all in its ghostly embrace, a cold hand tightening around their hearts. The whispers from the earth were growing louder, no longer faint murmurs but distinct, sorrowful cries, and they carried a chilling promise of retribution, a debt that would be paid in full. The final confrontation began subtly, a gradual tightening of the spectral noose around the remaining robbers. Old Man, already teetering on the brink of madness, was found one morning catatonic in his hut, his eyes wide with a terror that had seemingly petrified him. Beside him lay his share of the gold, now tarnished and cold to the touch, as if its very essence had been drained away. Bin, driven to the edge by sleepless nights and the constant feeling of being watched, finally broke his silence, his confession a torrent of terrified words poured out to a bewildered Father Tien. He spoke of the gaunt figure with burning eyes, the silent pursuit, the paralyzing fear. He begged for forgiveness, offering his share of the gold as penance, a desperate attempt to appease the unseen wrath. Father Tien listened with a heavy heart, his understanding of the unfolding events deepening with each frightened word. He knew the legends, the specific tale of Ilara and her lost love, betrayed for the very gold that now cursed these men. He realized the spirit's vengeance was not random but targeted, its tendrils reaching out to each of the transgressors in ways that mirrored their individual weaknesses and fears. He agreed to offer what solace he could to Bin, leading him in prayers and offering what little comfort the earthly realm could provide against a supernatural torment. The confrontation with Qian and Tan was more direct, more terrifying. One stormy night, as the wind howled through the valley and rain lashed against their small hut, the floorboards beneath which they had hidden the gold began to creak and groan with unnatural force. The whispers, usually faint, became a chorus of sorrowful cries, their voices laced with an unbearable grief and a chilling anger. The lamp flickered violently, casting grotesque shadows that danced on the walls, and the air grew icy cold, even colder than the storm raging outside. Then, the gold itself began to levitate from beneath the floorboards, hanging in the air between the terrified brothers, its dull gleam now radiating an unsettling aura. The spectral figure of a young woman materialized before them, her face pale and sorrowful, her eyes fixed on the floating gold with an expression of profound loss. Qian recognized her from his dreams, Ilara. Her silent accusation was more potent than any scream. Tan, despite his earlier skepticism, finally broke, his bravado shattered by the undeniable presence of the supernatural. He fell to his knees, sobbing uncontrollably, confessing their crime, begging for forgiveness from the spectral figure that offered no response, only a sorrowful, unwavering gaze. Qian, his heart heavy with guilt and fear, could only watch in helpless terror as the spirit's sorrow turned to a palpable anger. The wind howled louder, the rain beat down with renewed ferocity, and the gold began to spin violently in the air. Then, with a spectral shriek that seemed to tear through the very fabric of reality, the gold flew towards the brothers, not as solid objects but as streaks of cold, ethereal light that passed through their bodies, leaving them writhing on the floor in unimaginable agony, a pain that felt both physical and spiritual, a burning cold that consumed them from within. The aftermath in Oakhaven was one of stunned silence and a profound sense of unease. The storm subsided as quickly as it had begun, leaving behind a village washed clean but bearing the invisible scars of the night's terror. Old Man remained catatonic, a living testament to the spirit's power. Bin, though shaken, found a measure of peace in his confession and Father Tien's ministrations. His share of the gold now returned to the earth from whence it came. Qian and Tan were found the next morning, their bodies cold and still, their faces contorted in expressions of unimaginable terror, the stolen gold scattered around them, now dull and lifeless. The villagers, though horrified, understood. The earth had reclaimed its own. Mrs. Lan, her heart heavy with sorrow for Ilara but also with a sense of grim justice served, finally found a measure of peace, the desecration avenged, the spirit appeased. Father Tian offered a final reflection to the somber community, speaking of the enduring power of local beliefs, the importance of respecting the dead, and the inescapable consequences of greed and sacrilege. The stolen gold, the catalyst for so much suffering, was buried once more, returned to the earth, a silent symbol of the futility of their crime and the enduring power of the unseen world. Balance was restored to Oakhaven, but the heavy price paid would serve as a chilling reminder for generations to come. Some debts are paid not in coin, but in the very essence of one's being, and the earth never truly forgets those who dare to disturb its eternal slumber.